Indian Island sits in the middle of the Penobscot River in central Maine, just north of the city of Old Town. From the air, the island resembles a leaf, about a mile long and a quarter mile wide, its eastern shore flanked by a series of rapids, where the river breaks white over rocks. Home to about 500 people, the island is the seat of the Penobscot Nation, and the largest of more than 200 islands in the reservation, which extends north up the river for nearly 60 miles. The Penobscot people have lived here for at least 10,000 years. Their name for themselves is Panawahpskek, very roughly translated as the people of the Rocky River. In the Penobscot language, the river is called Panawahpskek, which translates again very roughly to the place of the white rocks, or where the rocks widen. We're using the Penobscot name as the title for this episode because Indigenous names get anglicized so reflexively in American journalism that the original names can start to feel like footnotes, even in the stories that are about the people whose languages produced them. This is one of those stories. In the rest of the episode, though, we'll use the anglicized Penobscot because it's what the Penobscot Nation itself uses in its own legal and political documents. For most of the 10,000 plus years that the Penobscot people have lived along the river, it's been the nexus of life: the road, the calendar, the culture, and the food. Atlantic salmon runs once numbered in the millions here. Eels filled the shallows in spring. Sturgeon, tomcod, alewives, blueback herring, and shad all came up from the sea to spawn in the gravel. The Penobscot built weirs, wooden stakes and branches woven across the current to funnel fish into traps to catch them. They smoked and dried what they couldn't eat fresh. Trade routes followed the water in every direction. Then, in 1967, a company called International Minerals and Chemicals opened a manufacturing plant 25 miles downstream from Indian Island, on the east bank of the river in the town of Orrington. The plant made chlorine and caustic soda, the building blocks for things like wood pulp bleach, plastics, and household cleaners, using a process that required mercury. That mercury became waste, and over 33 years, it entered the Penobscot in two ways: through a pipe that discharged contaminated wastewater directly into the river with the knowledge and permission of state regulators, and through five unlined landfills on the property, where solid mercury laden waste was buried and slowly leached into the groundwater below. By the time the plant shut down in September of 2000, between 6 and 12 metric tons of mercury had entered the river through the discharge pipe alone, a figure established years later by the Penobscot River Mercury Study, a court ordered scientific investigation. The mercury moved south with the current, settling into the sediments of the lower Penobscot River and the upper reaches of Penobscot Bay, the same waters where Penobscot Nation members have fished for millennia. On February 18, 2014, the state of Maine announced an emergency closure of 7 square miles of the lower Penobscot River and the Penobscot Bay to all commercial fishing for lobster and crab. Testing had found that mercury had absorbed into the flesh of the lobsters and the crabs, drawn up from the contaminated river sediments over decades, and concentrated at levels the FDA considered unsafe for human consumption. On October 26, 2021, a Penobscot Nation member named Molly and Bryant, the nation's first tribal ambassador, walked to a podium at the federal courthouse in Bangor, Maine. Two organizations, the Maine People's Alliance, a statewide environmental advocacy group, and the Natural Resources Defense Council, a national nonprofit, had filed a federal lawsuit in 2000 demanding that the plant's corporate owners fund a cleanup of the mercury contaminated sediment lining the bottom of the river and the bay downstream. The Penobscot Nation joined the case. A settlement had been proposed, and Bryant was there to speak to it. She told the court that her people had been promised, by federal law, the right to fish the river in perpetuity, but could no longer eat what they caught. Today, the manufacturing plant in Orrington has been mostly demolished. Two of the original five unlined landfills have been excavated and their contents removed entirely. The other three have been capped, a layer of clean material placed over the top to reduce the amount of rainwater percolating through. A groundwater treatment system on the site captures some of what continues to leach out, but the landfills were never lined, and it's not possible to line them now. The contaminated soil inside of them has been moving into the surrounding groundwater for more than 50 years, and the state of Maine has ordered Mallinckrodt, the corporate successor to the plant's original owner, to excavate and remove it. As of 2025, Mallinckrodt has been cited twice for failing to make meaningful progress. The company continues to argue that the site is no longer a danger. The Maine Department of Environmental Protection disagrees. While that standoff continues between the company and Maine's environmental regulators, the mercury in the soil has nowhere to go but down. You're listening to Ecocide, a podcast about environmental disaster. Each episode investigates a moment when human activity collided with the natural world, what happened next, and who was left to deal with the fallout. The Penobscot River begins as two streams. The West Branch flows out of Seboomook Lake, a remote body of water in the high forest of central Maine, about 200 miles inland from the Atlantic. The East Branch begins further north, draining the country around Mount Katahdin, the highest and most famous peak in Maine. The two branches meet at Medway, in the middle of the state, and from there the river runs south for another 100 miles until it empties into Penobscot Bay on the mid-coast of Maine, about 30 miles west of Acadia National Park. In total, the watershed covers more than 8,000 square miles, nearly a quarter of the entire state. Most of the watershed sits on bedrock that was scraped clean by the last ice age. About 14,000 years ago, the Laurentide ice sheet that covered northeastern North America began to melt. The Penobscot River emerged from underneath it, swollen with meltwater and finding new channels through old valleys. Salmon were among the first fish to follow it inland. They didn't need much, only cold, clean gravel to lay their eggs in and enough insects in the overlying water to feed their young when they hatched. As the ice continued to retreat, the salmon kept moving north. The people followed. Archaeologists have dated occupation sites along the Penobscot to at least 10,000 years ago. The oldest salmon bones recovered from stream-side hearths in the watershed are 7,000 years old. By the time European traders arrived in the early 1600s, the Penobscot were one of several nations whose homelands ranged from western Maine to the maritime provinces of Canada. In 1857, a writer from Concord, Massachusetts named Henry David Thoreau hired a Penobscot guide named Joseph Polis to take him by canoe through the lakes and rivers where the tribe lived. Thoreau was already known for his book Walden, published 3 years earlier, and he's now remembered as one of the founding figures of American nature writing. Polis was a respected character in Penobscot Nation, a businessman, councilman, and eventually the governor. He was also one of the few Penobscot of his era who could read and write in English. The trip became the basis for the longest section of Thoreau's posthumous book, The Maine Woods. The Joseph Polis that Thoreau described, sharp, funny, and skilled, comes through in Thoreau's pages as a full human being, something 19th century American literature rarely managed when it came to Native people. By the time Polis paddled with Thoreau, the river had already started to change. The first sawmills had gone up at the falls in nearby Old Town in 1798. By 1837, more than 200 mills were operating in the towns along the lower river. The wood they cut went down the Penobscot in log drives so heavy that the river was sometimes choked from bank to bank. The mills needed dams to hold and release water, and the dams blocked the salmon runs. By the late 1800s, the Bangor Dam, the Vesey Dam, and the Great Works Dam, each just downstream from Indian Island, had cut the river's salmon population to a fraction of what it had been. The next wave of industry was paper. In 1882, the Penobscot Chemical Fiber Company opened a paper mill in Old Town, just across the river from Indian Island. By the early 20th century, paper mills lined the Penobscot from Millinocket to Bucksport, and they needed water to cook the wood pulp, wash and screen the fibers, and bleach them white. They returned that water to the river loaded with chlorinated organic compounds, dioxin, and a heavy load of suspended fiber. By the 1960s, large stretches of the Penobscot were classified by the state of Maine as Class D, the lowest rating, considered fit only for industrial use and the discharge of treated waste. In 1965, a Maine senator named Edmund Muskie stood on the floor of the United States Senate and made the case for a federal water pollution program. Muskie had grown up on the Androscoggin River, another Maine river degraded by paper mills, and he'd built much of his early political career around water quality. Maine science writer Catherine Schmidt, in her book The President's Salmon, Restoring the King of Fish and Its Home Waters, noted that, for Muskie, the smell of home was paper mill effluent. Muskie would go on to become the principal author of the 1972 Clean Water Act, but the law arrived too late for the Penobscot River to escape what was coming next. That's because in 1967, 2 years after Muskie's Senate speech, but 5 years before the passage of the Clean Water Act, a chemical company called International Minerals and Chemicals broke ground on a lot at the eastern shore of the Penobscot River in the town of Orrington. The plant would manufacture chlorine and caustic soda using what's called a mercury cell process, a method that required tons of liquid mercury in constant circulation and that produced both liquid and solid waste that was saturated with mercury. The river had no chance. Chlorine is one of the most useful industrial chemicals on Earth. It's the basis for PVC plastic, municipal water treatment, paper bleaching, pharmaceuticals, and household cleaners. To make it, you start with brine, salt water, and run an electric current through it. The current splits the salt molecules, releasing chlorine gas at one electrode and sodium hydroxide, also called caustic soda, at the other. The chemistry is straightforward, but the question is what you use as the conductor. There are several options. One of the oldest, developed in the 19th century and used widely from the 1890s through the late 20th century, was liquid mercury. The brine flowed across a thin layer of mercury at the bottom of a flat steel tank, with the mercury serving as one of the electrodes. It was efficient, reliable, and produced pure caustic soda, but it required enormous quantities of mercury to be in motion at all times. A typical plant operated with several tons of metallic mercury circulating through the tanks at any given moment. Over time, that mercury escaped. Some evaporated as vapor and was vented through the roof. Some leaked into wastewater and went down drains. Some got into the brine sludge the plant produced as a solid byproduct, which then had to go somewhere. There were two places that it went. The liquid waste, the contaminated wastewater from the tanks, left the plant through a discharge pipe directly into the Penobscot River. State regulators knew about it and permitted it. That was the standard industrial practice in the 1960s. The Clean Water Act, which passed in 1972, created a federal permit system to control discharges like this one. It worked by capping how much of a pollutant a company could release and tightening the cap over time, while still allowing the discharge to continue under permit. So the plant kept discharging, its mercury levels dramatically reduced as the limits tightened, but never zero. The pipe ran for 33 years, only going dry once the factory itself closed decades later. The solid waste was a different problem. The manufacturing process left behind a thick, heavy sludge, a concentrated residue loaded with mercury compounds that couldn't flow through pipes. And regulations, even in 1967, prohibited dumping solid industrial waste directly into waterways. So the plant buried it on site. The plant in Orrington was built by International Minerals and Chemicals, or IMC, a company headquartered in suburban Chicago. IMC was one of the largest agricultural chemical companies in the country at the time. The 235-acre site sat on a steep bluff above the water, with several streams running through it. 5 landfills, all of them unlined, were dug into the property to hold the mercury laden brine sludge. There was nothing between the waste and the soil beneath it, no liner, no barrier. Over time, rainwater percolated through the landfills, dissolved the mercury, and carried it down through the soil and into the groundwater, moving toward the river. In 1982, IMC sold the plant to Hanlon Group Incorporated, which operated it under the name LCP Chemicals. In 1991, Hanlon filed for bankruptcy. HoltraChem Manufacturing acquired the plant through the bankruptcy proceedings in 1994 and operated it for more than 6 years before closing it permanently in September of 2000. The amount of mercury that escaped from the Orrington plant during its operating life is the subject of a court-ordered scientific study. The Penobscot River Mercury Study, led by Canadian fisheries biologist R.A. Bodali, with a panel of scientists from Stony Brook University, the University of Manitoba, and the consulting firm Environ International, was charged by U.S. District Court Judge John Woodcock with reconstructing the plant's contribution to the river's contamination. In its Phase 2 report, filed with the court in 2013, the panel found that before 1970, when federal and state regulation tightened, the plant was likely losing somewhere between 10 and 23 pounds of mercury per day to the river. Federal regulations tightened through the mid-1970s and 1980s. By 1987, when a new federal law called the Toxic Release Inventory first required companies to publicly report their chemical discharges, the plant was releasing less than 2 ounces of mercury per day. But that's only the regulated discharge. The Phase 3 report documented that mercury was still moving off the site through 2 other pathways: surface streams that ran across the property and into the river, and groundwater seeping out of the unlined landfills. During a large rainstorm in the year the team monitored the streams, 4 pounds of mercury washed off the site in a few hours. So, how does a metal like mercury become a poison? Mercury is the only metal that's liquid at room temperature. In its elemental form, mercury sitting in river sediment isn't directly hazardous to people who swim in the water or drink it. The problem starts when mercury enters that water and meets bacteria. Certain microorganisms in lake and river sediments, particularly anaerobic bacteria that live in the muck at the bottom of slow-moving water, can take up mercury and convert it into a different compound, methylmercury. Methylmercury is the form that matters for human health. Unlike elemental mercury, methylmercury is absorbed efficiently by living tissue, and once it's absorbed, it stays there. It binds to proteins, accumulates in organs, and crosses the blood-brain barrier. In humans, chronic exposure causes neurological damage, developmental delays in children, cardiovascular disease, and a range of other problems. The most famous case is Minamata, Japan, where a chemical plant discharged mercury into a coastal bay through the 1950s and 1960s. Many fishermen who ate the fish developed a degenerative neurological condition: loss of sensation in the limbs, tunnel vision, slurred speech, and paralysis. Nearly 1,800 people died from what would become known as Minamata disease, with thousands more suffering from severe but non-fatal symptoms. Many of those affected had children born with severe neurological damage, at a rate 12 times higher than in the rest of Japan. Methylmercury also accumulates up the food web through a process called biomagnification. Bacteria are eaten by zooplankton, which are eaten by small fish, which are eaten by larger fish. At each step, the mercury concentration multiplies. By the time it reaches a top predator, an osprey, an eagle, a striped bass, or a human, the mercury concentration in tissue can be up to 1,000,000 times higher than the concentration in the surrounding water, in the most contaminated systems. The Penobscot River Mercury Study began sampling the river in 2006, 6 years after HoltraChem closed the manufacturing plant. They were measuring mercury in water, surface sediments, marsh soils, fish, shellfish, marsh birds, and waterfowl. The picture they assembled was bleak. In the river sediments closest to HoltraChem, mercury concentrations reached 815 nanograms per gram, nearly 15 times the regional background level, and well above the federal threshold at which toxic effects on bottom dwelling aquatic life are expected. In fish, eels sampled near the plant carried more than 2.5 times the mercury concentration the study panel considered safe for human consumption. In the marsh birds nesting at Mendel Marsh, a tidal wetland just south of the plant, more than 90% of the Nelson sparrows tested had blood mercury levels above the threshold for toxic effects on the birds themselves. The pattern was the same across every category. The closer to HoltraChem, the higher the mercury. The Phase 2 report estimated that the upper estuary would take between 22 and 78 years to recover by natural processes alone, and only if no new mercury was added. On April 6, 2000, 5 months before HoltraChem closed it, two organizations filed suit against the plant in federal court. The lead plaintiff was the Maine People's Alliance, or MPA, a statewide grassroots advocacy group that had been organizing against environmental contamination in Maine since the 1980s. The co plaintiff was the Natural Resources Defense Council, or NRDC, a national environmental nonprofit. The Penobscot Indian Nation joined the suit shortly after. The defendants were HoltraChem itself and the chain of corporate owners that had operated the plant during its 33 years. By 2000, IMC had a complicated history of its own. In 1986, it had purchased Mallinckrodt, the same St. Louis chemical company that had refined uranium for the Manhattan Project, from Avon Products. 8 years later, the combined company renamed itself Mallinckrodt. That's why the lawsuit names Mallinckrodt as the defendant, not because Mallinckrodt built the plant, but because the company that built it eventually took Mallinckrodt's name. The legal vehicle was the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, a 1976 federal statute that allows citizens to sue facility owners for ongoing contamination caused by hazardous waste. RCRA citizen suits are difficult to win because the plaintiff has to prove not only that contamination exists, but that it presents an imminent and substantial endangerment to human health or the environment. The bar is high by design. The statute was meant to allow private citizens to fill enforcement gaps, not to substitute for state regulation. The Maine People's Alliance was led at the time by a man named John Diefenbacher Krall, a longtime environmental and labor organizer in the state. Diefenbacher Krall would later say that the case took up most of his working life for the better part of a decade. The NRDC's lead lawyer was Mitch Bernard, who had been litigating environmental cases since the 1970s. The Penobscot Indian Nation's interests were represented through the nation's own attorneys. In April 2002, after a bench trial, U.S. District Judge Gene Carter ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. Carter's decision in Maine People's Alliance versus HoltraChem Manufacturing Company found that the contamination at the Orrington site did present an imminent and substantial endangerment to the Penobscot River and the people who depended on it. He ordered the defendants to fund a comprehensive scientific study of the river to determine the extent of the contamination, assess the threat to human and ecological health, and recommend remediation. The study was to be conducted by a panel of independent scientists chosen by the parties and approved by the court. The defendants were ordered to pay for the entire investigation. The defendants appealed. In December of 2006, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit affirmed Carter's ruling, allowing the study to move forward. The Penobscot River Mercury Study Panel was assembled in 2006 and began sampling the river that summer. The Phase 1 report was filed with the court in 2008. The Phase 2 report, the one that estimated 22 to 78 years for natural recovery, was filed in 2013. Phase 2 also recommended active remediation. The natural recovery option, the scientists concluded, would take too long. Mercury was continuing to be stirred up from the contaminated sediments by tides and storms. Active intervention could reduce recovery time substantially. The two main options were capping, covering the most contaminated sediment with a thick layer of clean sand or gravel to seal the mercury in place, and dredging, which would physically remove the contaminated material from the riverbed entirely. Either approach, or a combination of both, would work faster than waiting for the river to clean itself. The Penobscot's tidal character makes that intervention more complicated than it would be in a river without tidal influence. Twice a day, the tide pushes ocean water back up the estuary, counteracting the downstream current that would otherwise gradually carry contaminated sediments toward open water and dilution. Instead, the tide moves mercury laden particles back upriver during each flood cycle, spreading contamination into areas that might otherwise clear more quickly. Any capping material placed over contaminated sediment has to be thick and dense enough to stay in place against the tidal movement, and any dredged area will be re exposed to mobile contaminated sediment being carried in on the next flood tide. The river, in other words, is working against its own cleanup. The court would now need to decide what to do. That decision would take another decade. In the meantime, the state of Maine would close 7 square miles of the lower Penobscot to commercial fishing. The Penobscot Nation would file a separate lawsuit asserting that its treaty rights extended to the entire main stem of the river, and the people who lived on or worked the lower Penobscot would continue, year after year, to live with what the plant had left behind. In 1980, after a decade of litigation that began with a federal lawsuit called Passamaquoddy v. Morton, the Penobscot Nation, the Passamaquoddy tribe, and the Holton Band of Maliseet Indians signed an agreement with the state of Maine and the United States. The agreement was codified by Congress as the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act and was signed by President Jimmy Carter on October 10, 1980. The Settlement Act provided $81.5 million in federal funds to compensate the tribes for land that had been taken from them illegally, most of Maine, in effect, under treaties that had violated the Federal Trade and Intercourse Act of 1790. Of that money, $54.5 million went to a land acquisition fund that allowed the tribes to buy back roughly 300,000 acres. The Settlement Act was praised at the time as a model of negotiated resolution. It was also structured in a way that limited tribal sovereignty in ways the tribes hadn't fully understood. The act made the Penobscot Nation and the Passamaquoddy tribe subject to most state laws, in a way that no other federally recognized tribe in the U.S. is. On most internal tribal matters, the nation was sovereign, but on most matters involving non tribal lands or non tribal people, including most environmental regulation, the state of Maine had jurisdiction. As the Penobscot attorney Sherry Mitchell, who would later become one of the most prominent voices on tribal sovereignty in the country, describes in her 2018 book, Sacred Instructions, the agreement was asymmetric in ways the tribal negotiators could not have fully anticipated. The question of who had jurisdiction over the Penobscot River itself, the lifeblood of the Penobscot Nation's identity, went unanswered in 1980. We'll circle back to that later. The Penobscot Nation operates its own Department of Natural Resources, which has been one of the most impactful tribal environmental programs in the country. Its Water Resources program began testing water quality in the Penobscot in 1986. Then, in 2000, the same year HoltraChem closed and the same year MPA filed its lawsuit, the nation's water testers, led by Water Resources Program Manager Dan Kusniers, documented a pattern of falsified water quality reports by a factory run by Champion International Paper. The company ended up receiving an $800,000 fine. As Paulina McDougall, a historian at the University of Maine who has studied Penobscot culture and history for more than 4 decades, observes in her book, The Penobscot Stance of Resistance, the testing program had effectively turned the Penobscot Nation into one of the most rigorous environmental enforcement entities in Maine. The Penobscot Nation's testing program also extended beyond the river itself. Kuznier's team had monitored dragonfly nymphs in ponds and lakes across Penobscot Nation Trust lands. The nymphs spend their juvenile lives in water, accumulating contaminants the way fish do, and serve as a sensitive early indicator of mercury moving through freshwater systems far from the plant. It's the kind of monitoring that only happens because the nation built the scientific capacity to do it. In 2012, the Maine Attorney General's office issued a formal opinion that would become known as the Schneider Opinion. William Schneider, the Republican Attorney General at the time, wrote that the Penobscot Nation's reservation, the islands in the river, did not include the river itself. The water around the islands, he wrote, was state water. The nation's treaty-protected sustenance fishing rights applied only to the islands and to the water immediately adjacent to them. The river, in his interpretation, belonged to Maine. The Penobscot Nation responded by filing suit. The case was Penobscot Nation v. Mills, Mills being Janet Mills, who had succeeded Schneider as Attorney General in 2013 and would later become governor. The nation argued that the Settlement Act had explicitly preserved their sustenance fishing rights, and that those rights extended to the entire main stem of the river. Several of the largest paper companies in the state, Verso, Lincoln Paper, and Tissue, Great Northern Paper, and others, intervened on the state's side. They argued that if the nation were granted jurisdiction over the river, it could effectively regulate the wastewater discharge permits that allowed their mills to operate. In 2018, in the middle of the litigation, a Penobscot Nation took a step that drew international attention. You may remember it too. The General Council voted to amend the tribal law to recognize the river itself as a person, with rights of its own. Penobscot attorney Sherry Mitchell, who had been a legal advisor on the matter, writes in her book Sacred Instructions that the vote was an attempt to make legible, in legal terms, what had always been true in Penobscot understanding, that the river was kin, and that its protection was not a regulatory question, but a relational one. Mitchell describes being raised to view water as her relative, that she had grown up in and around the waters of the Penobscot, and that the history of her people was tied to them. The Penobscot Nation v. Mills case wound through the federal courts for a decade. In 2017, a three-judge panel of the First Circuit ruled in favor of the state. The nation petitioned for rehearing before the full court. The full First Circuit granted that petition, heard new arguments, and in 2021 issued its ruling, again against the nation. The Penobscot Nation appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. In April 2022, the court declined without comment to hear the case. Penobscot Chief Kirk Francis called it a modern-day territorial removal by the state. The Penobscot Nation today does not have legal jurisdiction over the river that bears its name. Molly Ann Bryant is the daughter of Barry Dana, who served as chief of the Penobscot Nation from 2000 to 2004. Her great-aunt is Donna Loring, who served as Penobscot Nation's tribal representative in the Maine state legislature for many years and wrote a book called In the Shadow of the Eagle about that experience. Loring's book documents a different fight the nation was waging in those same years, not over Mercury, but over who had the authority to regulate pollution in the first place. Three paper companies, including Champion International, the same company who falsified water tests the nation's own scientists had caught, were fighting the tribes in court over the right to regulate wastewater discharge under the Clean Water Act. To weaken the tribe's position, the companies demanded the nation turn over its internal records on the dispute. Barry Dana was inaugurated as Penobscot chief on November 4, 2000. Days later, a Maine judge held him and two Passamaquoddy governors in contempt for refusing to produce the documents, giving them a choice between jail and compromising the tribe's sovereignty. Loring and Passamaquoddy representatives Donald Soktoma worked to find a way through it, and the following year, Maine's highest court overturned the contempt order, ruling that the tribe's internal deliberations were protected from disclosure. It was a different case than the one against HoltraChem, but it was the same era, the same overmatched nation, and, in Champion International, sometimes the same company on the other side of the table. Molly Ann Bryant became the Penobscot Nation's first tribal ambassador in 2017. She held that role until 2024, when she became executive director of the Wabanaki Alliance, a coalition of all four federally recognized Wabanaki nations in Maine that advocates for restoration of full tribal sovereignty. When she stood at the federal courthouse in 2021 to testify at the HoltraChem fairness hearing, she was speaking for a nation that had been promised, by treaty, the right to fish a river it could no longer eat from. In 1932, Frank Siebert traveled from his home in Pennsylvania to Indian Island. He'd come because he was interested in the Penobscot language. There were perhaps 150 fluent speakers left at the time. Siebert had taught himself the basics of historical linguistics on the side, primarily the comparative methods used to reconstruct extinct languages from their living descendants. Eastern Algonquian, the language family to which Penobscot belongs, had been extensively documented in some of its branches but barely at all in others. Penobscot was one of the underdocumented ones. Siebert spent the summer of 1932 talking to elders. He came back the following summer and the summer after that. He kept coming back for the next 60 years. Siebert was, by every account that survives, a difficult man. He was demanding, abrasive, and extraordinarily protective of the material he gathered. He worked alongside several Penobscot speakers to fill notebooks with field transcriptions, recordings, and grammatical analyses. By the 1980s, he was widely regarded as the foremost living scholar of the Eastern Algonquian languages. He worked on a comprehensive Penobscot dictionary throughout his life, but wasn't able to finish it before his death in 1998. Through the terms of his will, his linguistic papers, decades of field notes, sound recordings of Penobscot songs and speech, and the manuscript chapters of his unfinished dictionary were bequeathed to the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, not to the Penobscot Nation, which received nothing. The rest of Siebert's estate told a parallel story. Over his lifetime, alongside his linguistic work, he had assembled one of the most significant private collections of Americana in the country, roughly 1,500 books, manuscripts, broadsides, and maps, most of them concerning Native American history, language, and culture. He owned the 1663 Eliot Indian Bible, one of the rarest books in American history, printed in Algonquin, and unusually, could read it. In 1999, Sotheby's auctioned that collection in two parts. The total sale brought in $12.5 million, and his daughters split the proceeds. The Penobscot Nation, whose culture and language had shaped the focus and value of that collection, received nothing from that sale either. Carol Dana had been teaching the Penobscot language on Indian Island for decades. She worked with Siebert for years and is now one of the most accomplished Penobscot language teachers of her generation. The nation's language program doesn't depend on what's sitting in a Philadelphia archive. It depends on living speakers like Dana, and the unbroken tradition that connects them to the elders who taught Siebert in the 1930s. What happened to Siebert's papers matters even so. A tribal member who wants to consult those field notes, recorded from their own elders in their own language, applies for access like any other researcher. The anthropologist Bernard Perley, a scholar of Wabanaki heritage who has written extensively on indigenous languages in the Northeast, calls this pattern mortuary linguistics, the practice of treating endangered indigenous languages as objects of academic preservation rather than as living possessions of the communities that speak them. Perley's argument is that the model of linguistic preservation that produced collections like Siebert's was structurally extractive. The language was treated as data, the data was owned by whoever had collected it, and the community that produced the data was a source, not a partner. The Penobscot Nation has made requests for the return of culturally sensitive materials from the collection. The American Philosophical Society has digitized some of them and made them available to the nation. The thread that connects this chapter to the rest of this episode is not direct, but it is real. The HoltraChem plant was permitted by the state of Maine to discharge a substance into a river that the people who lived on it had no jurisdiction to protect. Frank Siebert was permitted by the academic structures of his era to take a body of knowledge from a community that had no legal claim on what he made of it. In both cases, something foundational was extracted and placed beyond the community's reach by people who were never required to ask. Of the two thefts, the language is the one the Penobscot Nation has had more success reclaiming. There are more fluent speakers now than there were in 1998. The schools on Indian Island teach in Penobscot. The river is still poisoned. On February 18th, 2014, the Maine Department of Marine Resources announced an emergency closure of the 7 square miles of the Lower Penobscot River and Upper Penobscot Bay to all commercial harvest of lobster and crab, effective February 22nd. The closure extended from Fort Point in Stockton Springs west across the river mouth to Wilson Point in Castine, and north up the river. It included some of the most productive lobstering grounds in the region. The reason given was mercury. Tissue testing had confirmed that lobster from the closure zone exceeded FDA action levels for human consumption. In June 2016, the department expanded the closure to more than 12 square miles. Skeet Wyman was a 26-year veteran of the Bay's lobster fleet, working out of Stockton Springs on the western shore. He told the Bangor Daily News that the closure had felt like a punch to the gut. He'd been hauling lobsters out of those waters since he was a teenager. His father had done it before him, and his grandfather before that. Wyman worried that he'd been feeding these lobsters to his own children for years. Mike Dassat, another Stockton Springs lobsterman who had also been one of the on water samplers for the Penobscot River Mercury study, knew more about the contamination than most. He'd spent years pulling fish, shellfish, and water samples for the scientists. He'd seen the data going in. The closure didn't surprise him scientifically. What surprised him was how long it had taken. The Mercury study scientists had first detected dangerous levels of mercury in lobsters near the closure zone in 2006, 8 years before the closure. They'd shared limited early results with state agencies, but failed to communicate the more alarming follow up findings for years, apparently believing they already had. State toxicologists didn't see the full picture until 2013, when the complete Phase 2 report landed on their desks. It took one review to trigger the closure. The contamination had been there the whole time. The FDA action levels for mercury in seafood are based on consumer health, not environmental remediation. The fact that lobsters in the closure zone had exceeded those levels for years meant that anyone who'd been buying Penobscot Bay lobsters at a market or restaurant had probably been eating mercury they didn't know was there. The closure had economic consequences that rippled far beyond the boats. The Maine Lobstermen's Association had to manage a PR crisis that affected the whole country. Maine Lobster, as a brand, depends on the public's perception of pristine waters. A closure for mercury contamination was a story that the national food press picked up immediately. Restaurants started asking suppliers to certify the origin of their lobster. Some buyers backed away from Maine lobster completely, even though the closure zone was just a tiny fraction of the state's overall harvest. The closure remains in effect as of this recording. Lobstering inside the zone has been illegal for over 12 years. The Maine Department of Marine Resources reviews the closure periodically based on tissue testing data. But, as of 2026, there's been no indication that mercury levels in the closure zone have dropped enough to allow it to reopen. Phase 3 of the Penobscot River Mercury study, the remediation recommendation, was filed with the U.S. District Judge John Woodcock in 2018. The study panel proposed a multi pronged approach. The most contaminated mudflats and salt marshes near the HoltraChem site would be capped with clean sediment to prevent further movement of mercury. Specific high mercury hotspots would be dredged. Long term monitoring would continue for decades. The estimated cost was substantial and would have to be paid by the defendants, the chain of corporate successor that had owned the plant during its 33 years of operation. The defendants, by this point narrowed to Mallinckrodt US LLC, IMC's corporate successor, fought the remediation plan. The litigation continued through the late 2010s and into the early 2020s. By the time the parties reached a proposed settlement in early 2021, the case had been pending in federal court for 21 years and was the oldest active case in Maine's federal courts. In October 2021, Judge Woodcock held a public fairness hearing on a proposed settlement, what lawyers called a consent decree, meaning a deal the judge signs into law and can enforce as a court order, not just a private agreement between parties. Molly Bryant, then the Penobscot Nation's tribal ambassador, testified at the courthouse in Bangor. So did Penobscot attorney Sherry Mitchell, lobstermen, and representatives from the Maine People's Alliance and the NRDC. The hearing lasted several days. The proposed settlement was substantial in scope, but did not include any admission of wrongdoing by the defendants. On October 11, 2022, Judge Woodcock approved the consent decree. The terms required Mallinckrodt to fund the remediation work recommended in the Phase 3 report and to establish long term trusts to manage ongoing monitoring and additional remediation. The total commitment was at least $187 million, with up to $80 million more in contingency funds depending on how the work proceeded, a maximum of $267 million. The court appointed Greenfield Environmental Trust Group to manage two independent trusts, one focused on remediating mercury in the river sediments, the other on funding environmental projects to benefit the surrounding communities, including the Penobscot Nation, which received funding in the trust's first round of grants. In 2024, the trust funded its first $20 million in beneficial environmental projects, including a fish passage and water quality improvements within Penobscot Nation lands. The pilot capping project, which would cover 6 acres of tidal flats in East Cove near the former plant site, was in the permit application stage as of early 2025. Long term monitoring resumed under the same scientific protocols established during the Phase 2 and Phase 3 studies. The settlement was one of the largest environmental remediation agreements in the history of New England. Although it didn't include an acknowledgement by the defendant that the plant had caused the harm, Molly Bryant wasn't losing sleep over it. She said that the Penobscot Nation had not waited 22 years for an apology. They had waited 22 years for the river to start getting better. The settlement was the beginning of that process. There is a parallel narrative to the HoltraChem story, running through the same years, that is the closest thing to a redemption arc the Penobscot River has had in its modern industrial history. It begins in 1999, when the Penobscot Nation, 6 environmental and conservation organizations, the dam owner PPL Corporation, and several federal and state agencies began discussions about the future of the lower Penobscot's hydroelectric dams. There were 3 of them in the lower river. The VZ Dam, built in 1832 and rebuilt in concrete in 1913, sat just below Bangor. The Great Works Dam, built in the 1830s, sat between VZ and Old Town. The Howland Dam, on the Piscataqui River, the Penobscot's largest tributary, sat at the confluence of the Piscataqui and the Penobscot. Together, the 3 dams blocked roughly 2/3 of the historical Atlantic salmon spawning habitat in the watershed. They also blocked alewife, blueback herring, American shad, sea lamprey, striped bass, and every other anadromous fish that had once filled the river by the millions. In 2004, the negotiating coalition, formalized as the Penobscot River Restoration Trust, a partnership that included the Penobscot Indian Nation alongside American Rivers, the Atlantic Salmon Federation, Maine Audubon, the Natural Resources Council of Maine, the Nature Conservancy, and Trout Unlimited, reached an agreement with PPL. The trust would buy the VZ and Great Works dams and decommission them. The trust would also bypass the Howland Dam by building a fish passage channel around it. PPL would, in exchange, be allowed to increase generation at 6 other dams further upstream, where the impact on anadromous fish was lower. The trade off was carefully engineered. By every available metric, the deal would reopen far more habitat than it would lose. PPL would not lose generating capacity overall. The trust raised the money over the next 8 years. The Great Works Dam came down in 2012. The VZ Dam followed in 2013. The Howland Fish Passage was completed in 2016. As of that year, nearly 2,000 miles of river habitat had been reopened to migratory fish for the first time in 180 years. The river herring came back first, and fast. River herring is a category that includes both alewife and blueback herring, small, oily forage fish that historically returned to the Penobscot to spawn by the tens of millions. Before the dams came down, river herring runs in the Penobscot were measured in the tens of thousands. According to Maine's Department of Marine Resources monitoring data, the count reached 6 million by 2023. Atlantic salmon have not yet returned in similar numbers. Salmon in the Gulf of Maine are facing climate stresses that are unrelated to the Penobscot's freshwater conditions, and recovery from a population that low takes generations. But the habitat is there. For the first time since the early 19th century, an Atlantic salmon born in the upper Penobscot can swim to the sea and back without encountering a single dam. Dan Kuzniers, the Penobscot Nation's Water Resources Program Manager, has called the project the most significant ecological restoration in the eastern U.S. in his lifetime. The river herring are food for striped bass and other fish, which are food for seals and seabirds and Penobscot fishermen. They're part of a marine food web that has been starving for 2 centuries, since the construction of the VZ Dam in 1832. The Penobscot River, in this respect, has been one of the largest single contributors to the recovery of the Gulf of Maine ecosystem in modern times. But of course, none of that solves the mercury problem. The same fish that benefit from the dam removals are now exposed to the mercury moving through the lower river. The river that has been reopened, in other words, is the river HoltraChem left behind. Both stories are true at once. The redemption is real, but so is the lingering mercury. There is a tendency in environmental writing, near the end of a story like this one, to show that the worst is past and that the lesson has been learned. But we can't do that in this episode. The Mercury is still there, and the closure is still in effect. The Schneider opinion is still controlling law, meaning that the Penobscot Nation still has very little legal jurisdiction over the river that bears its name. What has changed is the people. Molly and Bryant, who was 14 years old when HoltraChem closed, is now the executive director of the Wabanaki Alliance, working to restore the sovereignty her parents' generation watched erode. Sherry Mitchell, born and raised on Indian Island, founded the Land Peace Foundation, an organization dedicated to the protection of indigenous land and water rights worldwide. Dan Kuzniers, who began testing the river's water in 1986, is still at it 40 years later. Skeet Wyman is still on the bay, fishing the parts of it that aren't closed. So is Mike Dassat. The Maine People's Alliance is still organizing. The NRDC is still litigating. Carol Dana is still teaching the language. The 2022 settlement requires Mallinckrodt to pay at least $187 million and up to $267 million to clean up the mercury in the river. The dam removals have already done what no amount of money could. They've given the river back to the salmon, and to the herring, and to the lamprey, and to the seabirds, and to the people who have always known that all of those things are connected. The herring runs of 2023 were the largest in modern memory. The plant site in Orrington hasn't followed the same arc. Two of the original five unlined landfills have been excavated and removed. The other three were recapped. But contaminated soil in the plant area remains unremediated. In March 2025, the Maine DEP issued a notice of violation to Mallinckrodt for failing to submit an adequate cleanup plan. The DEP was direct. The site is still a threat to human health, safety, and the environment. In October 2025, it issued a second notice. Mallinckrodt disputes the DEP's assessment, arguing that the remaining contamination poses no danger to public health. The plant closed 25 years ago. Mallinckrodt and the DEP are still arguing over the cleanup. Molly and Bryant told the court in 2021 that her people had sustenance fishing rights. They had treaties. The treaties hadn't been broken. The river had. The fish were still there. The Penobscot Nation just couldn't eat them. Skeet Wyman, in 2014, said something simpler. He'd been feeding those lobsters to his own children. Both of them were saying the same thing, that whatever the river was supposed to be, whoever it was supposed to feed, and whoever it was supposed to belong to, it had been taken from them. In March 2025, the Maine Department of Environmental Protection issued a notice of violation to Mallinckrodt, finding that large areas of mercury-contaminated soil at the former plant site in Orrington remained unremediated after more than 2 decades of cleanup work. In October 2025, the department issued a second notice. As of this recording, the site cleanup remains unresolved. In August 2025, Mallinckrodt completed a merger with Endo Inc., creating a combined pharmaceutical company. The cleanup obligations under the 2022 consent decree, up to $267 million, are carried by Mallinckrodt US LLC, a subsidiary of the newly combined entity. Environmental advocates and the Greenfield Trust are monitoring whether the restructuring affects the pace or reliability of those payments. The Penobscot River Mercury Studies Monitoring Program is still active. The Greenfield Trust has funded its second round of remediation projects. The closure of the lower estuary remains in effect. The Penobscot Nation v. Mills ruling remains controlling law in the First Circuit. The river herring runs continue to grow. If you want to support the organizations working to address the contamination of the Penobscot and the protection of the Maine coast, the Maine People's Alliance has been the lead community plaintiff in the HoltraChem litigation since 2000 and continues to advocate for environmental justice across the state. The Natural Resources Defense Council has been the legal lead on the case for over 2 decades. The Penobscot Indian Nation Department of Natural Resources runs the water testing and ecological monitoring programs that have made the nation one of the most rigorous environmental enforcement entities in Maine. The Wabanaki Alliance, led by Molly Bryant, advocates for the restoration of full tribal sovereignty for the 4 federally recognized Wabanaki nations of Maine. The Land Peace Foundation, founded by Penobscot attorney Sherry Mitchell, supports indigenous-led environmental and human rights advocacy worldwide. The dam removal work that reopened the lower Penobscot to migratory fish was the work of the Penobscot River Restoration Trust, a coalition that included the Penobscot Indian Nation, American Rivers, the Atlantic Salmon Federation, Maine Audubon, the Natural Resources Council of Maine, the Nature Conservancy, and Trout Unlimited. Most of these organizations continue active work on Maine river protection today. You can learn more about all of these organizations and find links to donate at ecosidepod.com/organizations. For listeners who want to read more of the original journalism, the Bangor Daily News has covered this story continuously since the plant closed in 2000, and its archive is among the most complete records of the litigation and remediation available to the public. Maine Public Broadcasting and the Portland Press Herald have also provided sustained coverage of the cleanup and the Penobscot Nation sovereignty cases. Finally, the Island Institute's Working Waterfront publication has produced some of the most detailed long-form coverage of the remediation planning. If you'd like to go deeper, episode sources and transcripts are available at ecosidepod.com/episodes. The stories in this podcast don't end when the episode does. For updates on ongoing cases, follow-up reporting, and new episodes as they're released, find us on Instagram at EcosidePod, or sign up for the newsletter at ecosidepod.com/newsletter. Ecoside is an independent narrative podcast. Each episode tells the story of environmental harm, who caused it, and who paid the price. These are the stories about what humans do to the natural world and what it takes to reckon with it.